Within this decade, the people building AI believe they'll have systems that can outperform humans at most economically valuable work. Every job that involves thinking, deciding, analyzing, creating, coding, writing, advising, all of it. This is not a fringe prediction. It's written into OpenAI's founding charter, and they say it openly. In medieval Europe, a handful of lords owned the land. Everyone else worked it, lived on it, paid rent for it. You couldn't survive without access to the land, because the land was the engine of everything. The lords knew that, that's why they kept it. Right now, a handful of companies are racing to own something that makes the medieval land grab look modest. They're racing to own intelligence itself. And if they get there, the question of who owns the land this time has a very simple answer. It isn't you. For most of modern history, the deal was roughly this. You show up, you work, you contribute to the economy, and in return the economy provides for you. It wasn't always fair. Unfortunately, it still isn't. But the basic transaction existed because it had to. Governments needed you to pay taxes. Companies needed you to do the work. The economy needed you to spend money. You were necessary. And that necessity was your leverage. What AI does at scale is threaten to remove that necessity in more and more sectors. And when you remove the necessity, you remove the leverage. And when you remove the leverage, you get something that looks a lot like a world where a small number of people own everything that matters, and everyone else negotiates from a position of permanent weakness. There is a word for that arrangement: feudalism. We taught it in history class as something that humanity had moved beyond. Anthropic, one of the leading AI companies, the one that markets itself as the safety-focused option in the race, has acknowledged that AI is writing between 70 and 90% of its code, according to an Anthropic spokesperson. Some teams are already at 90%. The programmers who once did that work are still employed for now, but their role in the process is shrinking every month. Anthropic employs some of the best engineers in the world, paying salaries that most people will never see in their lifetime. And even there, most of the code is no longer written by a human. If it's happening there, it's happening everywhere. And if that sounds like the beginning of the end for software developers, the data suggests it probably is. Of course, people have heard this before. Every wave of automation in history came with warnings about jobs disappearing, and every time new jobs eventually appeared to replace the old ones. The textile workers replaced by machines became factory workers. The factory workers replaced by robots became service workers. It always worked out, or so it seemed. And so borrow they did from that history to reassure themselves that this time is no different. But here's the thing. Most previous automation still left human judgment and higher level cognition as the scarce input. Machines did the lifting, the weaving, the assembling. What they couldn't do was think at scale. The thinking always stayed human, which meant the economy always needed humans at the top of the chain. What's different about AI is that the thinking is precisely what it's replacing. There is no higher rung on the ladder left to climb to. Take the Philippines. Around 8% of the country's GDP comes from business process outsourcing, call centers, customer service, administrative work. Millions of Filipino workers doing the cognitive tasks that companies in richer countries decide to offshore. It's not glamorous work, but it's stable, it's skilled, and for a generation of Filipino families, it's been the path out of poverty. AI can now automate a large share of the routine work inside that sector, especially call center, customer service, and administrative tasks. And the cost of deploying it is falling fast enough that companies don't need to make a philosophical argument about it. They just need to run the numbers. When that selector collapses, and the people who run those AI systems believe it will, what happens to those millions of people? What happens to the tax base that funds schools and hospitals and roads? And perhaps more importantly, what happens to the government's incentive to invest in those people at all once the people are no longer the primary economic engine? There is a concept in economics called the resource curse. Here's how it works. Countries that discover they're sitting on top of a valuable resource, oil, diamonds, gas, often end up worse than countries without it. Because once a government's revenue comes from a resource rather than from the labor of its people, it stops needing to invest in those people. Education declines, healthcare declines, institutions hollow out. Venezuela has more oil than almost anywhere on Earth. It also has 80% of its population living in poverty. Think about that for a second. Luke Drago, an AI researcher, has written about what he calls the intelligence curse. The same dynamic applies to artificial intelligence. When GDP comes primarily from data centers and AI systems, rather than from the labor and innovation of human beings, governments lose their economic incentive to invest in human beings. Why fund schools if the economy doesn't need educated workers? Why fund healthcare if people aren't the primary productive asset? Why listen to the democratic demands of citizens when citizens aren't generating the revenue? This is not guaranteed feudalism, but it's a feudal-shaped incentive problem. Whoever owns the compute, the models, the data centers, and the distribution owns the new productive land. And the lords won't ride horses or collect grain. They'll own the data centers. And the rest of us won't be serfs exactly. But we will be living in an economy whose owners have no structural reason to care whether we thrive or merely survive. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, made a passing comment recently that stopped a lot of people cold. He observed that it's actually quite expensive to grow a human being, 20 to 30 years of food, education, healthcare, before they become economically useful. By contrast, you can scale AI intelligence with more hardware. You just buy more chips, build more data centers, and the intelligence scales with it. He was making a practical point about the economics of scaling AI, a reasonable one actually. But listen to what that framing implies. Humans are expensive infrastructure. AI is cheaper infrastructure. And although that might sound dystopian, which it kind of is, if you're optimizing purely for economic output, the math is obvious. Meta is currently building what will be one of the largest data center campuses on Earth, 4 times the size of Central Park in Manhattan. A cluster of buildings that will contain more raw computational power than most countries have ever deployed. This is not the distant future, it's under construction right now. Across the industry, more money is flowing into AI development than has ever flowed into any technology in human history. And within that spending, researchers including Stuart Russell, who wrote the standard academic textbook on artificial intelligence, have warned that capability spending vastly outweighs safety spending. We're building something we don't understand, cannot fully control, and, this is the part that should worry you, cannot stop, faster than we've ever built anything. Imagine a software developer. Call him Marcus, 34 years old, 10 years of experience, good at his job. 2 years ago, he was billing clients at $120 an hour. Last year, that dropped to $90. This year, he's struggling to get to $60. Because the companies he used to work with have started using AI coding tools that produce in minutes what used to take him days. He's not unemployed yet, but the trajectory is clear enough that he started retraining for something else. The problem is that the something else he's retraining for, data analysis, prompt engineering, AI management, everyone else is retraining for it too. The floor is falling and everyone is running toward the same ladder. Marcus isn't a cautionary tale yet. He might be fine, but multiply him across the economy. The paralegal whose research work is now done in seconds by a legal AI. The radiologist whose imaging work AI is already matching or improving performance on in some tasks, while cutting reporting time significantly. The financial analyst whose reports are generated overnight by a system that never sleeps and never asks for a raise. These are not low-skilled jobs. These are the jobs that a generation of workers spent decades and significant debt qualifying for. And it's all happening at a pace that no previous wave of automation has come close to. ChatGPT went from 0 to 100 million users in 2 months. It took Instagram 2.5 years to hit the same number. The speed of this matters. It's the thing that makes this different from every other disruption, because it's the speed that removes the time society normally has to adapt. Now you might be thinking, this has always been the story. Technology disrupts, people adapt, new jobs appear. And maybe that happens again. Maybe there is some category of human contribution that AI cannot replicate and that the economy will restructure itself around. But even if you believe that, there is a problem that doesn't go away. The people who will own this transition are already decided. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, Meta AI, Microsoft, Amazon, xAI, a handful of companies backed by a handful of investors, building a handful of systems that will become the infrastructure of the entire global economy. When all productivity flows through systems owned by a handful of companies, those companies have a kind of power that no entity in human history has possessed. Not emperors, not oil cartels, not the Catholic Church at the height of its influence. Because what they will own is not territory or resources or institutional authority. They will own the capacity to think, at scale, cheaper than humans, forever. Historically, there's been a point beyond which unemployment destroys political stability. Germany's unemployment hit 30% before Hitler came to power in 1933. Mass unemployment contributed to the rise of fascism there and to the French Revolution a century earlier. When people have no economic role and no political voice, they eventually stop accepting the arrangement. The medieval serfs eventually revolted. The factory workers eventually unionized. But here's the thing about revolting against a lord who owns the land. You can burn the crops, you can storm the manor, you can take the land back, because land is physical and finite and can be seized. But how do you revolt against a lord who owns intelligence? The question of who owns the land this time has an answer that's becoming clearer every year. It's a small group of men, and they're almost entirely men, who are building systems that will eventually do most of what the global economy requires humans to do. When that happens, the leverage that ordinary people have always had — you need us to work, you need us to spend, you need us to pay taxes, you need our vote — evaporates. Medieval feudalism lasted roughly 1,000 years. It ended when the economic conditions that sustained it changed, when trade expanded, when cities grew, when the serfs had somewhere else to go. The question for this new version is whether the conditions that would end it will ever arrive. Because the data centers don't need to go anywhere, the intelligence doesn't depreciate, and the companies building it are not planning to give it away. Sam Altman has said publicly and repeatedly that the goal is to build artificial general intelligence, a system that can do everything a human mind can do, and that when that exists, it will generate enough wealth to, in his words, make everyone rich. That's the promise. The history of when a small group of people controlled something everyone else needed suggests a different outcome. The wealth concentrates, the people at the top lose their incentive to share it, and the institutions meant to redistribute it get captured by the people who already have it. It suggests, if you follow the logic all the way to the end, a world in which the question of who owns the land this time has already been answered. The paperwork has been filed, the data centers are under construction, and the rest of us are still assuming the ladder has another rung.